morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good to know you're there and awake. This is an absolutely super occasion, and can I, before I start, congratulate Meg and all the people that have helped her to put on this book festival, because it's really putting Felixstowe on the map, literally putting them on the map. So thank you very much indeed for that, Meg, and I hope the weekend's going to be a great success. Thank you. There's something about books that are comforting. How many of you got Kindles? Okay. I don't like them. I like the feel of a book. There is something about buying a book and opening a book that is really lovely and is a great adventure, because you never know what you're going to find when you open the pages. And so I'm absolutely delighted that Felixstowe has this book festival to promote reading, reading to everybody across the whole parameter of what there is out there in people's minds when they write books. And I know that we're going to be fascinated by Oggy, because I've been reading his blurb and he's been doing some very exciting things. I'm not sure that I would like to have done what we've done, but somebody has to do it, because we need to know what's going on in the world, don't we? And not much of it is nice at the moment. I don't know about you, but I get quite depressed when I put on the news. But we're not here to be depressed this morning, are we? No, absolutely not. So it is with really great pleasure that I declare Felixstowe Book Festival 2015 officially open.
Thank you so much. This is the first session. We are the pioneers. I'm just a compere, I'm Richard Walker, and I'm here to introduce Oggy Boytchev, who is the man that brings the bad news to our screens. Before we start, a big thank you to Seaport Freight Services, who have sponsored this entire festival. So thanks to them. Mobiles, if you've got mobiles, do turn them off. Although I don't think we've got any signal here, actually, so it probably makes no difference at all. Oggy is here to talk about his amazing book, Simpson and I. He's telling us about what lies behind the images we see on the screens, the bad news images. You know, behind the interviews, behind the star correspondence, there is a whole machine of fixing travel, security, and the creation of the story that we see. That's Oggy's job. There's a great line in the book which more or less describes what happens, and the line is that the cameraman gets the money, the correspondent gets the fame, and the producer gets the blame. Oggy's the producer. It's all your fault. It's time to explain yourself. Oggy Boytchev.
Thanks very much first for coming in this morning. Bright early morning, glorious day in Felixstowe. But before I start, I'd like to say that my thoughts this morning are with the families of the 38 people who died on the beach in Sousse in Tunisia. And as it turns out, according to the Tunisian president, most of them are likely to be British. Terrible news, but in the next few minutes I'll try to explain why this news reaches our television screens pretty quickly, and other news in which a lot more people die never do. I'm here this morning because my career at the BBC took me to some of the most dangerous places on earth. So which are these places? If I ask you a question, what is the most dangerous place on earth at the moment, you'll probably say, oh, it's the territory controlled by Islamic State. With a good reason, because of the enormous propaganda value this organization extracts from the violence it perpetrates. You may say it's Iraq itself, where since 2003, since the invasion, about 350,000 people died in sectarian violence. Lots of others are missing. We'll never know the true figure. You may say it's Afghanistan, where since 2001, since we went in to dislodge the Taliban and kill Osama bin Laden, because don't forget, this is why we went into Afghanistan. We didn't go there to introduce democracy. We went there to kill Osama bin Laden. So what happened in the last 14 years? 453 British soldiers died. Afghanistan is still ridden by civil war. The Taliban controls some of the territory. There is no-go area for the Afghan National Army. There is a no-go area for foreigners. And foreigners are frequent targets in Kabul itself. Only a couple of weeks ago, 2 hotels, which normally house foreign visitors, were attacked. This news doesn't get on the television screens anymore because there are no British troops in Afghanistan anymore. But I would argue that there is a far more dangerous place on earth. A place where a quarter of the population, nearly 5 million people, live in concentration camps. Those who try to escape are being fed to wild dogs to be eaten alive, and others forced to watch. There is mass starvation, and this country has nuclear weapons.
North Korea.
I'm talking about North Korea. We don't know anything about North Korea because foreign journalists are not allowed. Independent journalists are not allowed in North Korea. And this is basically one of the main reasons why some stories don't get on the news. Independent journalists are prevented from going there. Even the South Korean intelligence services often rely on pictures from North Korean television to decipher what's happening there, who is in, who is out. It's such a secretive state, but because it has nuclear weapons, there is absolutely nothing we can do about it. However, there is another conflict in the world, the deadliest single conflict in the world since the Second World War, in which 5.5 million people died, and it's hardly on the news. I'm talking about Congo. You remember there was this guy, Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled Congo, formerly Zaire, with an iron fist, and we supported him because he provided a counterbalance to the Soviet influence in Africa. When Mobutu was dislodged in the aftermath of the collapse of communism in 1997, 2 civil wars ensued in the Congo. And they're still simmering. And according to the United Nations, 5.5 million people have died in the country. Neighboring countries got involved: Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, Rwanda. Rape is being used as a weapon of war in the Congo. And it's documented by the United Nations. That piece of news only got on our television screens because Angelina Jolie and William Hague went to the Congo once to highlight the terrible things that are happening there. So what are these people fighting in the Congo for? In the southern province of Katanga, which borders Rwanda and Zambia, in very narrow mine shafts, little children mine a mineral called coltan. Coltan provides 2 very rare elements, niobium and tantalum. Every time you reach for your mobile phone or you want to start your laptop, these 2 elements are powering our mobile devices. The people who exploit the mine don't have any interest in allowing foreign journalists in the area. That's why this is one of the most underreported stories in the world. If I ask you, however, what is the most dangerous place on earth for journalists to work, you might decide to repeat the same list, and up to a point you may be right. There is a charitable organization based in New York called Committee to Protect Journalists, which has been documenting journalistic casualties across the globe since '92. So figures only exist since 1992. The number one position, not surprisingly, is held by Iraq. 187 journalists were killed in Iraq since '92, most of them since the invasion of 2003. Very few journalists died in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. There are reasons for that, because free journalism was not allowed, so there were not enough journalists there. This number includes foreign journalists who died during the invasion. Members of the BBC team which covered the invasion, Terry Lloyd from ITN, and so forth. Number two is held by Syria, with 63 journalists killed. The vast majority, in the last 4 years, since the civil war started, since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring in Syria. Amongst those is the wonderful Mary Colvin from the Sunday Times, who was killed in the city of Homs, where the uprising against President Assad started. And of course, the journalists whose deaths you've seen on television in the gruesome ISIS videos. However, further down the list, number 3 is held by a country which you would never have thought is a dangerous place for journalists. It's the Philippines, with 77 journalists killed in the Philippines since '92. These are mainly brave local journalists trying to expose corruption. The next one down is Algeria. Don't get much news from Algeria on the television screens or on the radio. But there's been a civil war in Algeria since the early 90s, when a group called Gamal Islamiyah, the forerunner of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, has been waging a civil war against the secular government of Algeria. And the list gets even more interesting further down. Next one down is Russia. 56 journalists were killed in Russia since '92, the vast majority since the collapse of communism. Amongst them was a very brave journalist called Anna Politkovskaya, who was gunned down outside her apartment in Moscow in 2006 because she was trying to expose Russian atrocities in Chechnya. You remember this place in southern Russia? It was on the news in the 90s. So, having said all that, it transpires that journalism is a dangerous occupation. So it begs the question, why do we do it? Why do people like me and Simpson and other brave journalists, not just British, but from all over the world, go to these places? There is the headline reason, because it's in the public interest. To expose and to inform you what's going on in these places. But there is a far more unsettling reason for people like me, why we do it. And I'm the first one to admit that for me, it's been the adrenaline-fueled sense of adventure that you experience. It's playing with danger. And it's an addiction like any other addictions. And I was addicted to it. And lots of other journalists are addicted to it too. If I walked into the Shwatra Hotel in Erbil in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan, from where the coverage of Islamic State is coordinated by the Western press, Western media, I'll probably see the same faces that I've been seeing in war zones and in hostile environments since I started in the early 90s. It's a closed group of people who cover these events, and it's not just British journalists, very brave Italian, French, German and American journalists who cover these events. But they have admitted to me too that, like me, they were addicted to the adrenaline-fueled sense of adventure. Working in danger zones and hostile environments is a very claustrophobic experience. If you get the impression that we brave journalists, the Kate 80s and John Simpsons of this world, are parachuted in the desert of Iraq, and they get into these four-wheel drives and drive around and film this wonderful footage, it'd be wrong. Most of the time we spend in safe houses, in underground bunkers, driving only at certain times of the day or the night, depending on what kind of local advice you get. Back in 2007, at the height of the civil war in Iraq, I recorded the Fly on the Wall film about working in Iraq, which is not very long, it's about 6 minutes long, which I would like to show you before I comment any further.
Throughout the 4 years since the start of the Iraq invasion, I've been coming here every 6 or 7 weeks. It doesn't get better. In fact, it gets noticeably, steadily worse.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to welcome you to Baghdad, where the ground temperature is 21 degrees Celsius.
Since your last visit, there's been the usual type of attacks on the airport road. Generally speaking, lateral attacks, small arms and RPG. If something is to happen, we will debus, and something happens to this vehicle, we will debus from this vehicle into the second van, which is driven behind us.
You'd be a liar if you said you don't get nervous coming into Baghdad or leaving Baghdad in this particular way, because of course it's dangerous. But I don't feel too bad about it, because I think we've got good security advice, good security apart from anything else. I mean, there's Kevlar panels here all around us.
I always feel butterflies in my tummy doing this run, especially now when you're sort of stuck in traffic and you're surrounded by vehicles.
Like here, we're
like
just
here, like here.
But this is something Iraqis have to experience every single day.
Anything, especially a strange object lying in the road, can be a problem. We've reached the centre of the city at last, and the small, heavily defended street where our office is.
Hi. Hi.
Reuters and the BBC are the only British news organisations with a permanent presence left in Baghdad now.
Well, this, as you can see, is the centre of Baghdad. This is where the BBC office is. You must forgive me if I'm a little bit touchy about this, but you hear and read so much about how the very few Western journalists who are here are in the green zone and they've got heavy military protection and so on. Well, we're not in the green zone. We don't have heavy military protection. We do have people to protect us, but that's something else. The green zone is over there. It's on the other side of the river. It's not here. We work here, we go out every day to get our news and go and see people, and we get as good a picture of what's happening in Baghdad as we can. I say Baghdad because it's very difficult to get outside Baghdad to the rest of the country. We're not able to be there.
We'd only been here a couple of days when there was a big explosion on the main road outside the BBC office.
They reckon it's on outside the street, yeah, just outside our company.
Okay, looks like it's on the roundabout.
We ought to get out there. Stay there.
But we didn't offer a report on the bomb for that night's television news. 8 people dead doesn't seem to get into the news bulletins or onto the front pages much nowadays. It's a couple of column inches on an inside page.
It's what happens if you put huge amounts of explosive around the place. In this case, apparently what we're hearing now is it was done to target a minister's car that was just coming past here. I have no idea if that's true or not, but these things happen, of course, 3-4 times a day in Baghdad, just not usually quite so close to us.
Saturday, and we're heading out to Haifa Street, the scene of some big battles recently, as the Americans cleared out the insurgents who were operating there. Our security advisors tell us it's dangerous and we shouldn't spend more than 15 or 20 minutes on the ground.
The green zone, you couldn't possibly operate it as an embassy now.
Time was running out fast, but down a side alley, safely out of the line of fire, we found a whole group of people at a coffee house. He told us his son and a friend had been killed down at the far end of the street. A day or so later, we went to the hospital in the suburb of Yarmouk to film the bodies being brought in during the morning. It was a gory business and not particularly safe. A lot of the cameraman's efforts had to be taken up with trying to avoid some of the more dreadful sights. In television news, you often find yourself recording superb material which never finds its way onto the air. In this case, because we couldn't fit it into any of our reports. But I don't think I'll ever forget this surgeon who saved the young girl's arm.
Will you stay in Iraq or will you leave?
Yes, I will stay until death. I'll stay until death. I am. My father's dream was to be a doctor and to help poor people, and to help my people. I will stay here even if I know I will die tomorrow by killing. I will stay to the death.
You often hear or read people saying there's no point in reporting from Baghdad because you can't do a proper job here. Don't believe it. It's perfectly possible to report properly here. It's difficult and sometimes scary, but it's certainly worthwhile. Well worthwhile.
Before you start an assignment like this, you need to be mentally prepared for what lies ahead. And that's the main preparation one can do before you go out and cover a war zone or work in a hostile environment. I know some of my colleagues have been in a taxi to Heathrow to go to Baghdad and asked the taxi to turn back. They just couldn't do it. And I don't blame them, because unless you're mentally prepared to walk into a war zone, nothing will work for you. There are other things that you need to do before you go out there. And the BBC requires us to fill in the so-called risk assessment form. It's tedious, and I've tried to avoid it many times, but you can't. You've got to fill in the risk assessment form. However, in the risk assessment form, there are a couple of things which are actually worthwhile thinking about and talking about. Not in great detail. I'll tell you about what they are. One of them is the so-called proof of life questionnaire. It's very unsettling to fill it in. You've got to fill it in before each assignment because your questions have to be different from previous assignments, whatever reasons. This is designed to tell the BBC or the Foreign Office, whoever is leading negotiations, in your eventual kidnapping. So if you get nabbed by a group which wants something, before they start to negotiate about you, the Foreign Office will need proof that you're alive. Otherwise, what's the point of talking to them? And I know you'll say, the British and the Americans don't talk to terrorists. They do. I'm not aware of any ransom being paid by the British government, but they do talk to terrorist groups. So the proof of life questionnaire is something that you devise yourself, and only you, the BBC or the Foreign Office, and somebody very close to you would know. And it could be quite trivial. For example, what was the colour of Oggy's first car? An answer which only you, or very few people close to you, would know. Or where did Oggy go on holiday in the summer of 2003? And the answer would be Baghdad. But it's not easy to start filling in this section of the form, because it highlights the possibility that you might be kidnapped. So what if you are kidnapped, or if you're held by a hostile government, like lots of examples in Iran, when foreign journalists are detained by the Iranian government and then paraded on television with false confessions and accusations against their own governments. Then we come to the second unsettling portion of the risk assessment form, and that is the under duress signals. If you have the presence of mind, if you are in the unenviable situation of being kidnapped by the Islamic State and they ask you to read something in front of the camera, you could give signals to the BBC and the Foreign Office that what you're reading is actually done under duress. And I'm not going to go into details of what kind of signal it comes, but it could be a set of words, it could be movements and so on. But when we go on our hostile environment courses, which we're obliged to do every couple of years, they teach you how to send the under duress signals. However, that's all predicated on the fact that you will have the presence of mind to do it. So most of what we do on the ground is not just due to us, the foreign crews who jump on a plane and go to Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other place in the Middle East. It's the local help, the local fixers, stringers, translators, drivers, cooks. Don't forget cooks, people who cook your meal. They are some of the most important parts of your operation. Because as we found out to our detriment in Afghanistan, we were nearly poisoned by a cook who'd been influenced by the Taliban. So these people not only help us survive, but they come up with good stories, stories which we as foreigners, even if we spoke the local languages, would never discover. This is the subject of our second film. It's a little story, human interest story, which one of our fixers, translators in Baghdad, suggested to us, and it was nominated for various awards after it was broadcast in 2007.
Every morning at the Yarmouk Hospital in Baghdad, as regular as clockwork, the police vans bring in the night's crop of murder victims. It can be a pretty gruesome sight. Many of these people have been tortured before being killed. All of them were kidnapped because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and were from the wrong religion. This is the story of one of those victims, Farid Yunus Khashai. He was a driver for the Ministry of Housing. One morning recently, Farid was driving some ministry people to work.
They drove into the hardline Sunni stronghold of Adamir. It's just here. It's extremely dangerous for a Shiite Muslim to be here at all, just as it is for Westerners. But the fact is, it was his job. He didn't have any other choice. Somewhere along here, a group of armed men stopped the car, realized he was a Shiite, and took him away.
Farid's family live on next to nothing. We took them to a safe house to film them. They brought Farid's little daughter Zahra with them. His brother says the kidnappers asked for a ransom of $5,000. We had to sell everything, he says. My mobile phone, even our clothes. And we had to borrow the rest. Soon the kidnappers asked for $500 more. The family managed to borrow that too. Then Farid's body was found, shot through the head. He'd probably been killed even before the ransom was paid over. We had to tell Zahra her father had gone to heaven, he says. She asked me, will you be my father until he comes back?
Can you possibly forgive the people that did this?
Only God can forgive, Farid's mother says. I can't. It's destroyed their lives completely. But there's nothing unusual about all this. It happens here virtually every day. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
The death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a mere statistic. Who said that? Joseph Stalin. And for once, I agree with him purely from journalistic television point of view. If you show on the screen pictures of destruction and lots of dead bodies, it will never have the same effect as a personal story like this. The Sunni-Shia divide, I'm not going to go into this, I'll leave it for later when we talk with Richard and for audience questions, because we can go on forever. But for me, having seen what I've seen in the last 23 years, there is one particular incident which has shook me to the core, and that's the death of our translator in northern Iraq in 2003, in the so-called friendly fire incident, when our convoy was bombed by an American jet. 48 people died in the ensuing mayhem. Our translator, a very idealistic, intelligent young man, 22, spoke fluent English, who was very keen to help us get our stories, was injured by a shrapnel in the leg. His leg was cut off by a piece of metal. And he died in my arms while I was transferring him from a Kurdish pickup truck into American ambulance. After the assignment in northern Iraq, we were offered psychotherapy, and the only people on the team who refused were John Simpson and myself. I didn't want to talk about it, I didn't want to discuss it with anybody. But for years after that, I would wake up with the vision of Kamran Razak dying in my arms while I was putting him into the ambulance. And that's something which no other story, and believe you me, we've been at the center of big explosions, and the incident in northern Iraq itself was a pretty gruesome experience when you see lots of other people die, but when you witness the death of somebody who not only is very close to you, but who actually does that for ideological reasons rather than for money, it's a very unsettling experience. On that note, I'll wind up my presentation and I'll leave Richard and you to ask questions.
I'll use my own voice. Thank you so much. We'll throw open questions in a moment. I just myself like to ask Oggy a couple of things first. Your book opens with a personal story, and it's a pretty powerful passage. So I'd just like you to speak about yourself for a moment. In 1985, you were working, I think it would not be unfair to say, in an obscure Bulgarian shipping company in Sofia, Bulgaria, behind what used to be called the Iron Curtain, unable to travel. In 1986, the following year, you were working at Bush House in London, in the BBC World Service. How did that happen?
Well, stranger things have happened. Well, I used my first overseas company trip from Sofia to Cairo, to Port Said actually, to meet. I don't want to get into the details about it. It was a ship I had to meet there, flying under Bulgarian flag. And I decided not to return to Bulgaria. Those were the days when people like me were a rarity. I bought a ticket to London, and when I arrived at Heathrow, I just walked up to immigration and showed my Bulgarian passport and said, I'm a Bulgarian citizen and I want political asylum. How many people did that at that time? Very, very few. So I was kept at Heathrow for about 5 days until they ascertained whether I was a security risk or not. And I was let out, and the woman who interviewed me, who I believe was from MI5, said, off you go, here's some money to get on the tube. There is a hostel for Polish war veterans in Victoria, and they're expecting you. And I said, but how? You've taken all my documents. What if a policeman stops me in the street and asks who I am? And she just sort of superciliously smiled and said, well, police in this country don't normally stop people in the street and ask for documents. So this is how it all started. I applied for many jobs before, in the summer of '86. Before a letter turned up from the BBC Bulgarian section, inviting me for an interview. I joined the section then broadcasting the news in Bulgarian back to Bulgaria, the BBC News, that is. And after the Iron Curtain fell, I moved to television and eventually ended up working with Charles Simpson. I could never have foreseen this when I was growing up in Bulgaria.
So we learned from your presentation that there are a lot of huge frustrations in working in foreign news, and one of them is that there are stories which, for whatever reason, you cannot cover. You talked about DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, where, as you say, 5 million plus people died in a conflict which was essentially not covered. South Sudan is a similar case, probably 2 million people died in the long-run Second Civil War there. I don't recall seeing it on the screens. Is there anything we can do about that? Whose fault is that?
It's not a cop-out answer, but I think it's a collective fault. It's partly this is due to the environment in which news editors operate at the moment, with the fractious nature of news and the chase for ratings. It doesn't matter how worthy your story is. If people switch off their television screens, no editor, no network will tolerate that. Secondly, it's you. It's the nature of news that you consume. It's the nature of news that you want to see, and it's a subconscious decision you make every time. The BBC is doing something very interesting with its news app at the moment. It's got 3 sections of news. The top stories, these are the stories that the BBC news editors decide that are the most important for the day. The most read stories, these are the stories which get the highest number of visits on the mobile app by you, and I can tell you they never coincide. With very, very few exceptions, maybe on a day like yesterday, when lots of British tourists died on a beach in Tunisia, the 2 stories might have coincided for some time. But you prefer to click on different stories. And that's not a reflection on you. This is how news works. The general public is informed about certain stories more than others. So it's very difficult to sell a story on 10 o'clock news which you don't have the background. Because it's very difficult in 2.5, 3 minutes to explain the background to the conflict in DRC. Or in Mexico, another totally underreported story. I'm writing about Mexico in my book a little bit. 120,000 people have died in Mexico since 2006 in the so-called war on drugs, when the army was sent against the drug cartels. 30,000 people are missing, summarily executed, some of them students who were protesting against both the drug cartels and the government. It's impossible to get on the news. Simpson and I only managed to do this story because we promised the editor of the 10 o'clock news that we will get an interview with the president of Mexico. Not because we will do the story of the futile war on drugs. So it's a very complex problem, and I can't blame just the news editors at the networks. Different networks have different priorities and all that. But you can't sell a news story to the general public unless the general public is prepared for it, unless you have some background knowledge. And there is a lot to be said about this in how the news media prepare you for these stories. It starts slowly, it starts from the newspapers, documentaries and all that, because you can't just bang 2 minutes. In the first quarter of the 10 o'clock news about something that's happened in Mexico, you just startled and say, oh, but I've just been on holiday to Mexico and nothing happened to me.
So it's one of the great sort of secrets of journalism is that a lot of journalists can't actually write very well. And foreign correspondents basically can't write for toffee. That's the normal rule. Did you always plan to write a book?
Yes. Especially after I started working with Simpson, I began keeping a diary. Not quite about writing a book, the book that I wrote. I didn't plan to write the book because, like with the news networks, in the publishing industry, people mold you into doing stuff which you didn't intend to do in the first place. But I thought that I would write eventually a book about my work in war zones and foreign parts. So keeping a diary, if anybody here wants to write a factual book about themselves or anything else, keep a diary. It's invaluable because human memory is very transient. You forget.
So perhaps we'll find out if that's what people do want to do. I'm going to ask if anyone in the audience would like to put a question to Oggy. Yes, please.
How do you feel about celebrities like Angelina Jolie, Cher going to Romania, etc.? How do the journalists feel about these celebrities going into their field?
I think it helps. Again, it's not a popular, most of my colleagues will disagree, but it helps to highlight a story which is previously unknown. Like with the example of the DRC, the Congo story. If it hadn't been for Angelina Jolie, it would never have got on 10 o'clock news. I'm afraid that's the brutal truth. Because I know from experience, I tried to do the story for the 10 o'clock news with John Simpson. And we tried to get some access. I mean, it's very difficult to get access to the areas where most of the fighting happens. But you just don't need the fighting, you need to explain the background. How do you explain, unless you're allowed to go and film the coltan mines, which are at the core of the fighting, the explanation will be incomplete. And it's very difficult. I've tried for many years, when we worked in and out of Zimbabwe undercover, this story time and time again cropped up. Because in Africa, everybody's talking about it, but not here. So any celebrity endorsement, I'm afraid, helps promote the awareness of the story.
Does it make it momentary though? Because
it is momentary. It is very momentary, and it's very shallow. Because the cameramen tend to concentrate on Angelina Jolie when she goes there, and not on what's happening in the background.
And what she's wearing, etc.
Exactly.
Please.
Does that all come back to, you said you switch on your app, you choose whatever news you want to read, okay? Isn't that general apathy? Frankly, everyone is thinking, actually, we've heard all that before. What's going on here? They're very insular and only really interested in what's happening on their doorstep, what is actually happening to their lives and the people immediately around them.
I think you just hit the nail on the head. This is precisely why some stories don't get reported. Because if there is a story which has a direct impact on your life, you will want to read it. You will want to. And lots is being said and read about, all these wars are about oil and all that. Yes, because it impacts directly on us. The price of petrol, the standard of living, and all that. That's why you're genuinely more likely to read a story which revolves around oil in a region which is rich in oil than something else that doesn't have an impact on your life.
So does that then come back to the documentaries? I mean, BBC are producing fantastic documentaries. That's a half-hour or 1 hour programme filled with everything that you're telling us doesn't actually get on the news. That's where we should be watching.
Yes, that's why I'm a great fan of BBC 4, and I'm glad they're not going to axe it. Because BBC 4 produces some fantastic documentary, Channel 4, and all that. I mean, in the BBC Charter, we have the the mandate to journalists and producers is not only to inform, but to educate as well. And this is what I mean by telling you the background of a story, educating you about the importance of a story. But you can't do this education on the 10 o'clock news. It's impossible. 10 o'clock news just follows the big news agenda, which has, as I said, direct impact on taxes, on the standard of living, on the NHS, and all that. Many times we've offered stories from difficult parts of the world, and I remember once we were on a very rare visit to Iran, and offered a story for the 10 o'clock news, and it was dropped because a little girl went missing in Somerset, and this is what happens.
I was just thinking of that very point.
Yeah.
So much news on one woman taking her child away because the court had made a stupid decision or something, you know.
Yes, but you underestimate how many people are interested in
Yeah.
this. If you go on the app, it was the top story of the most read stories on the BBC app.
But it is one of the responsibilities of the news journalists, isn't it, to show people why their stories are relevant to them.
Yes, and that's why there is a big burden of responsibilities on the top brass in news, not just at the BBC, but all the other networks. And to their credit, Channel 4 and ITN do an excellent job. To their credit, even Sky News are moving towards this more solid, sound, proper journalism, because they know that it makes commercial interest. People are genuinely interested in solid news.
Do we have another question?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many news channels these days. So you think you've got all this immense variety. I mean, sometimes there are some in-depth things, but most of the time you think, well, I've heard this news, I want to hear something different about somewhere else. And you turn on another channel and you get the virtually the same thing. And I mean, it seems crazy. I mean, why have all these news channels?
That's why lots of people are turning off their televisions and go online, and most young people get their news online. And this is the sad thing, because most of the young generation, sort of 18 to 24-year-olds, get their news from various social networking apps. And they think that if you've read it on Facebook, it's true. It's not. Because at the World Service, Richard and I have worked at the BBC World Service, there was this basic principle which educated me in journalism. You don't have to be the first with the news, but you have to be always right. You have to sit on the story until it's absolutely confirmed, you know that it's correct, and only then can you broadcast it. Whereas now, with the proliferation of all these channels, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. I want to be first with the news, and then the sad thing is, then they bury the story, and if you haven't seen it on this channel, no one actually bothered that somebody's broadcast the wrong news.
And interestingly, because the World Service had a slightly different news culture to the domestic service, so you might find that the domestic service had beaten you with the news because the World Service was tending to hold back, looking for corroboration from
corroboration, explanation. The World Service would never, the same as two sources, but also the World Service would never broadcast a story without background explanation, because you can't assume that everybody knows what's behind the story.
There was always a rule of the two independent sources to corroborate the story. And a source might be a journalist from another network, one of the wire services, something like that. And you know, there are famous cases like where you had two independent sources in a certain country. They're the only two independent sources. But then when it transpired that they were having an affair with each other, they were no longer independent sources. I think there was a question from that side of the room. Please.
There are lots of news organisations out there, but you seem to have started with and stuck with BBC. Why the BBC?
Because I think it's the greatest news organisation in the world. I have had my frustrations with the BBC management over the last 23 years. I left the BBC a couple of years ago, not in anger, but I had reached the end of my tether with the BBC. However, I have to tell you, it's still the greatest news organisation in the world. It just, you're frustrated with mediocre management, with obsession with budgets, and all sorts of things, but it still produces the best news content in the world.
You end your book with, I think, a really quite powerful passages of personal conversations with John Simpson. I don't think anybody is going to claim that John Simpson, or a person like John Simpson, is a particularly easy individual to work with. He's, I think, perhaps you could tell us how driven he is. What is your final assessment?
He's an incredibly ambitious and incredibly driven person. You don't get where he is at the top of the greasy pole unless you have to have talent, and he has talent. He's one of the few new journalists who actually can write, and he writes beautifully. But he's incredibly driven, because you can be a brilliant writer and still prefer to sit on your sofa in London or wherever, and not do what he does. When he decides that he wants to cover a story, he will do anything that's humanly possible to do it. And sometimes his behaviour may be perceived as aggressive, abrasive, and all that, but it's all in pursuit of the story. And don't forget, most of the competition for stories comes not only from rival networks, but from within the BBC. Other correspondents and other news crews within the BBC. So sometimes you've got to keep your plans very secret, like we did. I described that in the book, when we went to work undercover in Zimbabwe in 2008. We were asked to do that by the then editor of the 10 o'clock news, one Craig Oliver, who is incidentally now David Cameron's communications chief. He's moved on from the BBC, but he knew the value. He knew the value of news, and he knew how to protect the people who get the news for him. So when he asked me, before he even asked John, he asked me whether it would be possible to go into Zimbabwe undercover, do a story, maybe 2 or 3 films, but then do a live broadcast from Zimbabwe into the 10 o'clock news. I was in awe, and I said yes, absolutely yes, but I've got one condition. This conversation stays between the two of us. No one else would know, not even the Johannesburg bureau chief, the bureau which covers Africa, because things leak within the BBC. Once it's leaked within the BBC, it leaks outside the BBC, and all he needs is another brave correspondent who will go and do it before we do.
Now you are outside the BBC. In less than a minute, do you have another book under your hat?
Yes, it's a very challenging endeavour. I'm writing a spy thriller about the hunt for Gaddafi's gold. Something more popular. So hopefully I need to submit the first draft to my agent by September, so we'll see how it goes.
Polishing.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was going to ask, the people that you work with in the war zones, like the locals, the interpreters and things like that, when you eventually leave, do they get protection?
Well, that's a very good question. And if you remember, there was a big but the BBC normally protects its sources, but in a different way to the British government. what highlighted this problem was the plight of the Afghan translators for the British Army. After we left Afghanistan, they were basically left on their own. Everybody knew that they worked for the British Army and all that, and some of them got intimidated. To my knowledge, no one was killed. But the BBC protects its helpers in different ways. To start with, it's a completely different premise. If you have a helper on the ground in Afghanistan, that person actually prefers to stay there because this is where his or her livelihood is, helping the BBC or other networks. It's the main source of their income. So they prefer to stay. Sometimes we've relocated them, sometimes we've given them, not new identities, but because we can't do that, but moved them to another town and all that. But in the majority of the cases, they prefer to stay there and work. And sometimes, most of the times, when the story goes away, we don't just give up on them, we pay them a retainer over many years because you never know when the story will break out again.
There are more questions. I know we do have to wrap up. I'm terribly sorry. We are finally out of time.
So just very, very quickly, you stopped working at the BBC. I suspect you're never going to retire. How are you getting that adrenaline rush now? The one you're addicted to.
Fast cars.
I like it.